All right, so today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff. You sent us some excerpts from Noam Chomsky's Hegemony or Survival, and wow, this book.
Yeah.
It's pretty intense when it comes to U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how Chomsky takes this really broad view of history,
Yeah.
and connects events across decades
Mm-hmm.
to kind of reveal these underlying patterns of power and ideology.
Right.
It really gets you thinking about the narratives that we just kind of accept,
Mm-hmm.
without even questioning them.
Absolutely. And right off the bat, he starts with this idea that
Yeah.
controlling public opinion is kind of the key to maintaining power, especially in a democracy. And it just made me think how much of what we believe is actually shaped by forces we're not even aware of.
That's exactly what Chomsky's getting at. And he traces this all the way back to the early beginnings of propaganda, long before social media.
Right.
Think about Edward Bernays,
Yeah.
the father of public relations. He talked about engineering consent.
Right.
He saw this manipulation of public opinion as a fundamental part of how democracies function.
Okay, so it's not just about giving people information, it's about carefully crafting the message to actually guide their opinions and ultimately their actions.
Exactly. And Chomsky gives these really chilling historical examples.
Okay.
Like the Ministry of Information in Britain during World War I.
Right.
And Wilson's Committee on Public Information here in the U.S.
Yeah.
These were really early attempts to systematically shape public opinion on a massive scale.
Wow.
And their techniques were super influential on later propaganda efforts.
So how does this control of the narrative actually play out in practice? Does Chomsky give any specific examples?
Oh, he definitely does. One of the most striking examples he uses is the way the war on terror was framed,
Okay.
especially during the Reagan era, back in the 1980s.
Oh,
Chomsky argues that this wasn't just about fighting terrorism abroad.
right.
It was also about solidifying power and controlling dissent here at home. He even goes so far as to say that the goal of national security states is to essentially eliminate the political participation of the numerical majority.
Well, okay, that's a pretty heavy statement. It sounds almost Orwellian.
Yeah, it's a provocative claim for sure.
Yeah.
He argues that this control is achieved through a variety of means, including manipulation of media narratives,
Yeah.
the use of fear in appeals to security,
Right.
and even the suppression of dissenting voices.
So he's really pointing the finger at the media in this whole process.
He's definitely critical of the role of the media.
Yeah.
He argues that it often acts as a mouthpiece for powerful interests,
Mm-hmm.
reinforcing the narratives that serve those in power.
So if this war on terror is part of this larger strategy to control the narrative and maintain power, does Chomsky see this as a uniquely American thing, or is this something that happens in other countries as well?
Well, Chomsky argues that this is a pattern that you can see throughout history, in various empires and power structures.
Right.
But he really focuses on the U.S. in Hegemony or Survival because of its current position as a global superpower.
Okay, so he's zooming in on the U.S., but within a larger historical context.
Yeah.
And this idea of controlling the enemy at home.
Right.
Does he connect that to what the U.S. is doing abroad as well?
Absolutely. He draws a direct parallel between controlling the population domestically
Okay.
and the use of more direct and often brutal means to achieve U.S. objectives abroad.
So military intervention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He uses this term imperial grand strategy
Okay.
to describe this consistent pattern in U.S. foreign policy
Okay.
that aims to maintain global dominance.
So it's not just about reacting to events as they happen. It's about a deliberate long-term plan to kind of shape the world according to U.S. interests.
Right.
Where does he see this imperial grand strategy starting?
Well, Chomsky traces it back to World War II,
All right.
specifically to the concept of the Grand Area.
Okay.
This was a term that was used by U.S. planners during the war to describe the regions of the world that the U.S. sought to control,
Right.
economically and politically.
Wow. So even during a global conflict, they were already thinking about their post-war position and how to maintain their power on a global scale.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
It really was like a blueprint for empire.
So that's a strong way to put it, but it gets to the heart of Chomsky's argument, right?
Right.
That after World War II, this grand area expanded significantly,
Exactly.
and the drive for global dominance has continued ever since.
It has.
And it's justified through various means, from economic influence to military intervention.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about brute force.
Right.
It's about using a combination of strategies economic, political, and military
Yeah.
to achieve its goals. Does Chomsky give any specific examples of how this imperial grand strategy has played out in recent history?
Oh, he does. One of the most significant examples he cites is the 2002 National Security Strategy.
Okay.
This was a document that was released by the Bush administration, and this document essentially asserted the right of the U.S. to use force preemptively
Okay.
to eliminate any perceived threats.
Wow.
This doctrine has been incredibly controversial and far-reaching in its implications.
It sounds like he's arguing that this document basically formalized a long-standing U.S. policy of interventionism,
Yeah.
but now with a new level of assertiveness and willingness to act unilaterally.
Exactly. And Chomsky argues that this interventionism is often masked by the language of humanitarianism,
Right.
a point that we'll delve into much more deeply in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
He's highly critical of this concept of humanitarian intervention, seeing it as often a guise for U.S. self-interest and a way to maintain its global power.
So it's this idea that the U.S. is acting as this benevolent force in the world, intervening to protect others.
Right.
But Chomsky's challenging that narrative,
Right.
suggesting that there are often these ulterior motives at play.
Yeah.
This is getting really interesting, but I think we need to pause here for now. There's just so much more to unpack, and I can't wait to dig into those specific examples of intervention and how Chomsky deconstructs the justifications behind them.
Sounds good. In the next part, we'll be exploring cases from Kosovo to East Timor to Iraq, analyzing how Chomsky challenges those conventional narratives
Right.
and exposes what he sees as the underlying motivations behind these interventions.
It's going to be a fascinating journey, so make sure you join us for part 2 of our deep dive into hegemony or survival. Okay, welcome back. So last time we were talking about Chomsky's concept of the imperial grand strategy
Right.
and how he sees it kind of playing out in U.S. foreign policy. It feels like we're just starting to scratch the surface of his critique.
Yeah.
And I'm eager to dive into some specific examples.
Yeah, let's get into the specifics.
Okay.
So remember how we talked about the U.S. using the guise of humanitarian intervention to justify its actions?
Right.
Well, Chomsky really challenges that narrative,
Okay.
especially when looking at events in Central America during the Cold War.
Okay, so we're going back to the 1980s,
Yeah.
a time of intense ideological conflict
Right.
between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. What examples does Chomsky focus on in this region?
He really dives deep into the U.S. involvement in Nicaragua,
Okay.
specifically the Reagan administration's support for the Contra rebels against the Sandinista government.
Okay.
And this was a brutal conflict
Right.
with a devastating human toll.
Yeah.
And Chomsky doesn't hold back in his criticism of U.S. policy during this period.
Yeah, he uses some pretty strong language to describe it, calling it a campaign of slaughter, torture, and barbarism.
Right.
It seems like he sees this as a clear example of U.S. intervention driven by something other than humanitarian concerns.
Exactly. Chomsky argues that the U.S. was terrified of the Sandinistas' success
Okay.
in implementing social and economic reforms
Uh-huh.
that benefited the majority of the population.
Okay.
He calls it the virus effect.
Okay.
This fear that these reforms might inspire similar movements in other countries,
I see that.
potentially challenging U.S. dominance in the region.
So it's not just about containing communism.
Right.
It's about preventing any kind of successful alternative to U.S.-style capitalism and political systems.
Yeah.
That makes the humanitarian intervention argument ring pretty hollow.
It does. And remember, this was happening at the same time that Reagan was talking about fighting the evil empire of the Soviet Union.
Right.
Chomsky highlights the hypocrisy of calling this a fight for freedom and democracy.
Yeah.
While supporting death squads and Contra forces
Right.
that were terrorizing the Nicaraguan people.
It's a stark contrast promoting democracy and human rights in rhetoric,
Right.
but supporting brutal regimes and violent tactics in practice.
Yeah. Does Chomsky offer any evidence to support this claim about the virus effect?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, he points to the fact that Nicaragua actually took the U.S. to the World Court
Wow.
for its actions and won.
Really?
Yeah. The court ruled that the U.S. was guilty of unlawful use of force and ordered it to pay reparations to Nicaragua.
Oh.
However, the U.S. simply ignored the ruling,
Wow.
dismissed the World Court as irrelevant,
Okay.
and continued supporting the Contras.
So the U.S. essentially acted with impunity,
Yeah.
even when found guilty of violating international law.
Right.
That kind of undermines the whole idea of a rules-based international order, doesn't it?
It does.
It sounds like a pattern we've discussed before,
Yeah.
where the U.S. seems to operate by a different set of rules.
That's a key part of Chomsky's critique.
Right.
He argues that the U.S. often disregards international institutions and norms when they don't align with its interests.
Okay.
And Central America is a prime example of this double standard in action.
Okay.
He also discusses El Salvador during this period,
Right.
another country embroiled in a brutal civil war.
Yeah, I remember reading about the horrific violence in El Salvador during the 1980s.
Yeah.
The U.S. was heavily involved there as well, right?
Absolutely. The U.S. provided massive military aid and training to the Salvadoran government,
Okay.
which was fighting against leftist guerrilla groups.
Right.
Again, we're talking about death squads, massacres of civilians, widespread human rights abuses.
It sounds eerily similar to what was happening in Nicaragua.
It is.
Does Chomsky see these two conflicts as connected in any way?
He argues that both cases demonstrate the U.S.'s determination
Okay.
to prevent the spread of leftist influence in Central America, even if it meant supporting brutal regimes and turning a blind eye to horrific human rights abuses.
So basically the ends justify the means.
In a way, yeah, he sees this as part of the broader imperial grand strategy.
Right.
The U.S. using its power to shape the political landscape of the region.
Regardless of the human cost.
Regardless of the human cost, exactly.
So it's not just about containing communism,
Right.
but about maintaining U.S. hegemony in the region and preventing any challenge to its dominance.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder about the long-term consequences of these interventions.
Yeah.
Does Chomsky address that at all?
He argues that this pattern of U.S. intervention in Central America
Okay.
has had devastating long-term consequences for the region,
Okay.
contributing to the poverty, the instability, and the violence
Right.
that persists to this day.
It's a cycle that's hard to break.
It is.
It's tragic how these interventions, often justified in the name of freedom and democracy,
Right.
can end up creating the opposite. You know, more suffering, more instability, and a deepening resentment toward the U.S.
Absolutely.
It's like the self-fulfilling prophecy of intervention leading to more chaos, requiring further intervention.
That's a really insightful observation.
Yeah.
And it gets to the heart of Chomsky's critique.
Right.
He argues that this pattern isn't limited to Central America,
Okay.
but can be seen in U.S. foreign policy around the world, including the Middle East.
That's a region where U.S. involvement has been particularly controversial and complex.
It has.
What examples does Chomsky highlight in this context?
One of the most contentious issues he addresses is the U.S.'s relationship with Israel. He argues that the U.S. has consistently provided Israel with unconditional support,
Okay.
enabling its occupation of Palestinian territories
Right.
and its military actions against neighboring countries.
That's a relationship that often gets framed in terms of shared values
Right.
and a strategic alliance against common enemies.
Exactly.
Does Chomsky buy into that narrative?
Not at all. He sees the U.S.'s unwavering support for Israel as serving its broader strategic interests in the Middle East,
Okay.
particularly when it comes to projecting power and controlling access to vital resources like oil.
I see.
He's highly critical of what he calls the special relationship between the two countries,
Okay.
arguing that it has perpetuated the conflict in the region and undermined the prospects for a just and lasting peace.
So he's challenging the conventional wisdom that this is about supporting a democracy in a hostile region.
Right.
He's saying there are deeper strategic calculations at play.
Yeah.
What specific policies or actions does he criticize?
Well, he's particularly critical of the so-called peace process,
Okay.
arguing that it's been a sham from the beginning.
Wow.
He believes that the Oslo Accords and subsequent negotiations
Right.
were never intended to lead to a genuine peace settlement,
Okay.
but rather to manage the conflict in a way that preserved Israeli control while giving the appearance of progress.
He must have some specific examples in mind.
He points to the Camp David negotiations in 2000,
Okay.
which are often portrayed as a missed opportunity for peace.
Right.
Chomsky argues that the Clinton-Barack offer was actually designed to be rejected by the Palestinians,
Okay.
as it would have left them with a fragmented and non-viable state.
I see.
He goes into detail about the proposed territorial divisions,
Okay.
comparing them to the Bantustans of apartheid-era South Africa.
Wow. So he's saying that the U.S. wasn't really interested in a just or lasting peace,
Right.
but rather in maintaining a certain power dynamic in the region that favored its ally, Israel. It seems like he sees this as another example of the U.S. using its power to shape outcomes, regardless of the principles it claims to uphold.
That's exactly his argument.
Mm.
He argues that the U.S. has consistently prioritized Israeli interests over Palestinian rights,
Right.
and that this bias has fueled the cycle of violence in the region.
Okay.
He doesn't stop there, though. He also critiques U.S. relations with other countries in the Middle East,
Okay.
like Saudi Arabia and Egypt.
Those are countries with complicated histories
They are.
and often criticized for their human rights records.
Yes.
How does Chomsky view the U.S.'s involvement with these regimes?
He's critical of what he sees as a pattern of U.S. support for authoritarian regimes in the region,
Okay.
often overlooking their human rights abuses
Right.
in the name of strategic interests.
It sounds like another example of the double standard he identifies in U.S. foreign policy.
It is.
Promoting democracy and human rights in words, but supporting dictatorships in practice when it suits their interests. What specific examples does he give to support this claim?
Well, he points to the close relationship between the U.S. and the Saudi royal family,
Okay.
despite Saudi Arabia's abysmal human rights record.
Right.
He also criticizes the U.S.'s long-standing support for Hosni Mubarak in Egypt,
Right.
who was a brutal dictator for decades.
Yeah, so it's about maintaining stability and friendly regimes,
Yeah.
even if it means supporting repressive governments.
Right.
Does Chomsky see this as like a successful strategy in the long run?
Well, he argues that this support for dictatorships has actually backfired,
Okay.
breeding resentment and instability in the region,
Uh-huh.
and contributing to the rise of anti-American sentiment.
Right.
He sees it as a classic case of short-term thinking,
Okay.
prioritizing stability over democracy and human rights, and ultimately creating more problems in the long run.
It sounds like another example of how good intentions, or at least the stated intentions, can lead to unintended consequences and actually worsen the situations they're trying to address. It's a sobering thought.
It is, and it brings us back to Chomsky's main point about the imperial grand strategy.
Right.
He sees these interventions in the Middle East, like those in Central America, as part of a broader pattern of U.S. efforts to maintain global dominance,
Okay.
even if it means sacrificing its own stated values and principles along the way.
It paints a pretty bleak picture of U.S. foreign policy,
It does.
driven by self-interest and a willingness to use its power, sometimes ruthlessly, to achieve its goals. It can feel overwhelming and even hopeless when you start to see these patterns.
Right.
Does Chomsky offer any way out of this cycle, any reason for optimism?
He does, despite the many negative examples he cites.
Okay.
Chomsky believes that change is possible,
Okay.
but it won't come from those in power.
Okay.
It has to come from the people, from grassroots movements demanding a different kind of world.
So it's not about waiting for those in power to change their ways,
Right.
but about people taking action themselves to push for a more just and equitable world.
Exactly.
What examples does he offer of this kind of resistance in action?
That's a great question, and one we'll explore more deeply in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm ready to hear more. This conversation has been eye-opening and thought-provoking,
Good.
and I'm eager to hear about these examples of resistance and how Chomsky sees them as potential catalysts for change. We've been like really deep in Chomsky's hegemony or survival, exploring his critique of U.S. foreign policy and what he calls the imperial grand strategy.
Right.
It can feel kind of heavy, honestly, seeing these patterns of intervention and control like playing out across the globe. But you mentioned that there's another side to this story, right?
Yeah.
That Chomsky also sees potential for resistance and change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
While he doesn't sugarcoat the challenges,
Right.
Chomsky firmly believes in the power of people to challenge these systems of domination.
Okay.
He points to like a range of inspiring examples where ordinary citizens have risen up to demand a more just and equitable world.
Give me some hope here. Where does he see this resistance taking shape?
Well, one area he focuses on is Latin America.
Okay.
Remember how we discussed the U.S. intervention in Nicaragua and El Salvador?
Uh-huh.
Well, Chomsky highlights how even in the face of brutal repression,
Right.
people in these countries continued to organize and resist.
Okay.
He talks about the role of liberation theology,
Okay.
which was this powerful movement within the Catholic Church
Okay.
that emphasized social justice
Yeah.
and the rights of the poor and oppressed.
Okay, so it's not just about secular political movements, but also about religious groups mobilizing for social change.
Right.
What's the connection to U.S. foreign policy, though?
Well, Chomsky points out that many priests and nuns who embrace liberation theology were actively supporting those who were resisting U.S.-backed dictatorships.
Okay.
They were providing sanctuary, speaking out against human rights abuses, and even organizing communities to challenge these regimes.
It's incredible to think about the courage it took to stand up to these powerful forces, knowing the risks involved.
Yeah.
It reminds me of those like iconic images of priests and nuns marching alongside protesters, demanding justice and an end to oppression.
Right.
It seems like Chomsky's arguing that like faith and social justice can be powerful allies in the struggle against imperialism.
Absolutely. And he connects this to what was happening back in the U.S. at the time.
Okay.
He talks about the solidarity movements that emerged in response to the violence in Central America. These movements brought together people from all walks of life.
Okay.
Students, activists, religious groups.
Right.
Who were outraged by what the U.S. was doing in the region.
So it's not just about resistance happening within those countries,
right,
but also about people in the U.S. taking action to challenge their own government's policies.
Exactly.
What form did these solidarity movements take?
Well, people were doing all sorts of things.
Okay.
Organizing protests, raising awareness through media campaigns.
Okay.
Even traveling to Central America to accompany refugees and document human rights abuses.
Wow, that takes a lot of commitment to travel to a conflict zone, to put yourself on the line like that.
Yeah.
It speaks to the depth of their conviction and their determination to make a difference.
Right.
Does Chomsky see these solidarity movements as having any real impact?
He argues that they played a significant role in raising awareness about U.S. complicity in the violence.
Okay.
And putting pressure on the government to change its policies.
So even in a powerful country like the U.S., citizens can organize and make their voices heard, influencing the course of events.
Yeah.
So it's a reminder that even those who feel powerless can find ways to exert influence and push for change.
Right.
But these movements were primarily focused on like a specific region, Central America.
Right.
Does Chomsky see this kind of resistance happening on a broader scale?
Yeah.
Addressing like global issues?
He points to the emergence of the global justice movement in recent decades.
Okay.
Which culminated in the World Social Forum.
Okay.
This movement brought together activists, organizers, and ordinary citizens from around the world to challenge what they saw as the harmful effects of corporate globalization.
Okay, so this is about moving beyond like regional struggles to address systemic issues that are impacting people across the globe.
Exactly.
What were their main concerns?
Well, they were demanding a more just and equitable world.
Okay.
One that prioritized human rights and environmental sustainability over corporate profits and unfettered free trade.
Okay.
The World Social Forum,
with
its slogan, "Another world is possible," represented a powerful rejection of the dominant neoliberal economic policies that they argued were exacerbating inequality and environmental destruction.
So it's about challenging the status quo.
Yeah.
The idea that there's no alternative to the current system. They're saying another world is possible, and they're actively working to create it.
Right.
It's a powerful vision. Does Chomsky see this movement as being successful?
Well, success is a complex thing to measure,
Right.
especially when you're talking about systemic change.
Yeah.
He acknowledges that these movements haven't achieved all their goals.
Okay.
But he sees them as a vital force for pushing the conversation forward.
Right.
And creating space for alternative visions of the future to emerge.
So it's about planting the seeds for change.
Yeah.
Even if the fruits of that labor might not be fully realized for years or even decades, it's about shifting the conversation, challenging the assumptions of the dominant narrative.
Exactly.
What other forms of resistance does Chomsky highlight?
Well, he's also optimistic about the potential of the internet and social media to empower grassroots movements.
Right.
These technologies allow people to connect with each other across borders.
Right.
Share information and organize in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades ago.
Yeah, it's amazing how technology can be used to bypass traditional gatekeepers and create spaces for alternative voices and perspectives to flourish.
Absolutely.
It's like democratizing information and giving power back to the people.
Exactly. He also sees the growing environmental movement as a crucial force for change.
Okay.
Especially in the face of the climate crisis. He recognizes the urgency of addressing this issue and believes that the environmental movement has the potential to create like a truly global movement that transcends national boundaries and unites people around a common goal.
That's a powerful idea, that the environmental crisis, while a dire threat, could also be a catalyst for global cooperation and a shift toward a more sustainable way of life.
Yeah,
Does he connect this movement to his critique of the imperial grand strategy?
absolutely. He argues that the relentless pursuit of economic growth and global dominance,
Right.
which is at the heart of the imperial grand strategy,
Yeah.
is ultimately unsustainable and destructive to both people and the planet.
Okay.
He sees the environmental movement as challenging this paradigm,
Right.
demanding a fundamental shift in values and a move away from the obsession with profit and power
Okay.
toward a more just and sustainable way of life.
So it's about recognizing the interconnectedness of these issues,
Right.
that environmental destruction, economic inequality, and militaristic foreign policies are all symptoms of a deeper problem,
Yeah,
a system that prioritizes short-term gain over long-term well-being.
precisely. And he believes that these movements working together have the potential to create a more just and sustainable world,
Yeah.
one that prioritizes human needs and the health of the planet over the pursuit of power and profit.
This has been an incredible journey, unpacking Chomsky's analysis of U.S. foreign policy and the potential for resistance.
It have.
It's been challenging at times, facing these uncomfortable truths, but ultimately empowering to see how people are pushing back and working to create a different kind of world.
Right.
What would you say is like the main takeaway,
Uh-huh.
the call to action that Chomsky leaves us with?
I think his message is clear. Be informed, be engaged, and be active.
Okay.
Don't accept the dominant narratives at face value.
Right.
Question everything. Seek out alternative perspectives.
Yeah.
And most importantly, find your own way to get involved in the struggle for a more just and humane world.
He's reminding us that we're not powerless, that
Yeah.
we have a responsibility to act.
Right.
And that even small actions can make a difference, whether it's
Mhm.
supporting a local activist group, educating ourselves about the issues, or simply having these conversations with our friends and families. We can all contribute to creating a better future.
Absolutely. He believes that change is possible,
Mm.
but it requires all of us to be engaged, to be informed, and to be willing to challenge the status quo.
That's a message that resonates deeply, especially in these times of uncertainty and global challenges.
It
This deep dive has been a powerful reminder of the importance of critical thinking and the power of collective action. Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope it's inspired you to continue exploring these ideas and to find your own ways to make a difference in the world.